Welcome to the show where we talk about human rights. It's called Atwood's Rights Nights. Welcome to Atwood's Rights Nights, where we discuss human rights for your entertainment. We hope all of you are well and are ready to listen to some literature-based discussion. Today we discuss, in her novel, The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood foretold Human Rights Violation 19, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, including freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek and receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. If only we had paid attention to this warning, our world might be a bit of a better place now.
Thank you, Jackie. Atwood's use of characterization is extremely effective when it comes to the prediction of human rights being violated. We have seen the citizens of North Korea, India, China, Russia, and many other countries being restricted from pornography according to the World Population Review. We have seen countries such as Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Uganda banning women from wearing clothes that are quote unquote too revealing, according to the World Economic Forum. Just look at Atwood's depiction of the unwomen on pages 118 to 119. Aunt Lydia, characterized as trembling with indignation, has made the handmaids believe that unwomen were always wasting time, they were encouraged to do it, they were godless. At the same time, the unwomen are also described with overall jeans with a green and mauve plaid shirt underneath and sneakers on their feet, who protested with signs such as "Take back the night." By directly characterizing Aunt Lydia as indignant, Atwood highlights the fact that higher religious powers such as Aunt Lydia were disgusted by the unwomen. Atwood creates two versions of the unwomen through her characterization. Firstly, we can imply with previous context that the unwomen are women of pornographic films, which are seen by religious powers as disgusting. Pornography, in a positive and consensual perspective, is a woman performing the acts of intercourse for their own pleasure and not as a chore to bear children. This is against the approval of Gilead, as intercourse is a pleasureless act solely for bearing children. But the other definition of an unwoman, as developed by Atwood, is women who stood up for their rights and had the freedom of expression to do whatever they wanted. The outfits of the unwomen, contrasting to the strict uniforms of the handmaids, illuminates the lack of freedom that the current women have compared to the women of the past. This striking dual characterization by Atwood furthers the idea that any woman who wanted to express herself in any form was seen as a disgrace, which completely goes against the Declaration of Human Rights, as people are entitled to their rights to freedom and expression and opinion. This isn't the only characterization used to develop a lack of human rights in Gilead. When we see the Japanese tourists on page 28, we notice that there is a conspicuous difference between the handmaids and the tourists. The tourists are bright-eyed, very cheerfully aggressive, and are wearing skirts reaching just below the knee, high-heeled shoes, they wear lipstick, and they seem undressed. When Offred really thinks about this, though, she realizes that she used to dress like that. That was freedom. Compared to all the red outfits of the handmaids, when their eyes aren't even visible to the public, we can see a definite difference between the tourists and the handmaids. Atwood uses the vivid descriptions of bright-eyed and cheerful to characterize the tourists as joyous and genuinely happy. And Offred's immediate reaction to the girls, we can see that Offred characterizes the girls as forbidden in her perspective, which outlines the customs of the people of Gilead. This traditional style, compared to the Western style, highlights the idea of freedom to choose versus freedom from harassment, which explains how little freedom of expression the people of Gilead really have. It offers connection to herself, and realizing that the freedom to wear what you want is a wanted freedom indirectly characterizes her as jealous of the tourists, thus showing the significance of expressing one's individuality in society. This lack of freedom of expression, as explained in the previous point, goes against the Declaration of Human Rights, as the whole population of Gilead, including the guards and the Marthas and the Econowives and the wives and even the commanders, have no freedom of expression. Overall, it is undeniable that characterization was the most vital tool used by Atwood to predict these violations of human rights.
Thank you, Talia. That was a solid argument. However, I would argue that Atwood's use of imagery is more effective in foreshadowing the present-day violations of Human Rights Article 19. When looking at your argument, in your examples, such as the description of the Japanese tourists, you were actually using a lot of imagery. Although this was characterization, you were using a lot of visual imagery when talking about their outfits and the expressions on their faces. And also this same thing happened when you were discussing the uniforms of the unwomen. This was another example of visual imagery. This shows how imagery presents itself within other techniques, proving that it is more important than the others, Without imagery, the other techniques simply would not be as effective. They wouldn't have as much depth and they would not be as effective. Moving on to my argument, I think that imagery makes theories tangible. When you use a technique such as characterization or even something like narrative, the audience is only absorbing words. Because of this, it is difficult to visualize some important points that the audience may end up overlooking. With imagery, readers are able to visualize scenes and even put themselves in the shoes of the characters in the scene, helping them to truly understand the author's message and purpose. For example, in Chapter 7 of The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood uses intense visual imagery to describe the scene of Offred and her mother burning pornography magazines. She describes on page 39 how the magazine riffled open in the wind of its burning, big flakes of paper came loose, sailed into the air, still on fire, and parts of women's bodies were turning to black ash in the air before Offred's eyes. The visual imagery of the magazine being torn apart and lit on fire, as well as the photos of the women turning to black ash, depicts the pornography as forbidden and taboo. The women are completely destroying it so that there are no remains of it left. This event was in protest to women being forced into doing sexual acts. Atwood's use of intense imagery gives the reader a mental image of the magazines being destroyed, furthering the reader's understanding of how impactful this protest was. As earlier mentioned in Talia's argument, pornography is banned on a governmental level in many countries, such as North Korea, for a myriad of reasons. This protest that Atwood described in her writing, majorly supported by intense and descriptive visual imagery, was an early step towards that level of censorship, showing how Atwood began to foreshadow this type of censorship. In Chapter 16, Atwood uses several different types of imagery to describe the first ceremony between Offred and the commander. On page 95, she describes the commander as smelling of mothballs and wearing a stupid uniform. This is olfactory and visual imagery, and it conveys an unpleasant image of the commander. Offred's negative perception of the commander displays how unwilling she is to be participating in a sexual act with him. This furthers the control that the Society of Gilead has over its inhabitants. Offred is being forced to engage in an intimate sexual act with a man that she finds displeasing, and it is heavily supported by Atwood's use of descriptive imagery to effectively show us, the readers, the type of power that the government has over its people. This example in Atwood's writing is similar to how many cultures around the world participate in arranged and forced marriages, and the people's opinions on these relationships is unconsidered by the government, which is directly related to the part of the Declaration of Human Rights, Article number 19, that discusses the right of freedom to hold opinions without interference. With that being said, Atwood, by using descriptive and frequent imagery throughout the novel, effectively foreshadowed several different types of violations of the Human Rights Article number 19.
Thank you, Mallory. Now, one of today's generous sponsors is Taco Bell. Right now, they're having their holiday sale where you can get their Chalupa's Cravings box for only $4.99. Now, back to the show. Thank you, Mallory, for that argument. However, imagery doesn't connect with the characters on a personal level. For example, the eye, in one of the quotes on Atwood in chapter 22, it says, "Then he winks, perhaps he is merely being friendly, perhaps he is an eye." This visual imagery doesn't talk about expressing individuality like in our article. Same with when Atwood also says in chapter 36, "I know better than to look an interpreter in the face. Most interpreters are eyes," or so it's said. They both don't give specifics towards being an individual. Now, moving on to setting. The setting of the book is very important because it is like the main foundation of where it all started and how individuality starts to slowly be stripped away. The first setting I want to talk about is the Republic of Gilead. In page 23, Atwood says, "The Republic of Gilead knows no bounds, and Gilead is within you." This contributes to setting because it shows how everything is controlled and that this place becomes a part of you, which doesn't allow anyone to express their individuality because they have to follow Gilead. Another time, on page 43, she says, "Ordinary is what you are used to. This may not seem ordinary to you now, but after time it will. It will become ordinary." This reflects the power of a totalitarian state. And a real life example could be North Korea, because North Korea only has one political party, and anyone against that party are forced to have the death penalty, which then this ties in with our article and how they can't express themselves individually. The next setting I want to talk about is the wall. On page 31, Atwood says, now the gates have sentries and there are ugly new floodlights mounted on metal posts above it, and barbed wire along the bottom and broken glass set in concrete along the top. No one goes through those gates willingly. This just shows how restricted the society is because they have a wall that goes around them, so they can't get out and travel. And she also says on page 50, which is marked by a large wooded pork chop hanging from two chains, women were not allowed to read, so they could only use visuals, because if Gilead can control their language, then they can control their thoughts, and this restricts them expressing their individuality. And if citizens, also another real life example is if citizens can speak other languages, some newspapers are censored so they cannot learn more, and the government is constantly watching them, which is restricting their individuality. Next is the church. On page 31, she says the church is a small one of the first erected here hundreds of years ago. It isn't used anymore except as a museum. Inside it, you can see paintings of women in long, somber dresses, their hair covered by white caps of upright men. In the dark clothed and unsmiling, our ancestors' admission is free. This museum is here to show their ancestors, or those that the society is based off of, trying to wash everything from their modern era away. And it also says how time here is measured by bells, as once in nunneries, and this represents a man whose only purpose in life was to be devoted to God, which shows how in Gilead people are only supposed to have one purpose in life, for handmaids to have children. So basically, all in all, setting, basically because of Gilead and because of how the society has been developed, they have taken away so much that has allowed them to restrict their individuality.
Thanks, Jackie. I see how the setting manipulates the characters, but honestly, I believe that the dialogue from the characters is the big area which fully shows how an oppressive society limits a person's expression. So you can see it really in theme number 1 and the lack of quotes on page 88, in the quote, "Give me children or else I die," and how this lack of quotes, it really continues the religious story into Offred's narration, and how really the handmaids in this story are just breeding machines. So although this is a religion-based society, that really shines through this dialogue and then next you can see it on page 61, where in the paradox, he said a forbidden word, sterile. And in this society, yes, it is true that the government evaluates women on their fertility, and they're stripped of their identities while the men get a free pass. And although this is inferred in the setting, it's really shown also through this dialogue. And although setting is an important factor, dialogue really represents the human rights violation number 19 a lot more. One point is on page 83, where Offred says, "He tells us what we want him to believe. He's very convincing," in reference to the man on the television. Offred's irony in this situation, the news is really supposed to report recurring events, but it's actually fake. This really bends the truth a little more. And also in page 46, and Offred in her encounters with the commander, the quote, "What would you like to read tonight?" he says. This contrast to the past, where Offred can read anything, really makes the tone tense because it reminds Offred of the freedom she used to have. And this ties to theme number 3, where the government's limiting media suppresses the knowledge of the people. The dialogue in this situation, the fakeness and irony of the man's dialogue, shows how the media is suppressing Offred and other characters' knowledge. Also, the contrast to the past and its tension emphasizes how her freedoms from gaining knowledge have been completely stripped. And this can also be seen in a real-life example in China. In the article, Freedom of Expression in China, a Privilege, Not a Right. Only the rich are allowed to gain more knowledge from the media, while the rest of the country has many restrictions on the government. And next, theme number 2, basic freedoms. This can be seen, basic freedoms are violated. This can be seen on page 176. In the quote, "It's the law, I have to let you all go." He said this almost gently, as if we were wild animals. So how the characterization of her boss and how the government started to treat women of that time is perfectly represented in this example, where they're called wild animals. This also can be seen on page 54 in the quote, "I feel so lonely, baby. I feel so lonely I could die." This is actually an allusion to Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. This song is outlawed, and the irony is that it's almost impossible to die in this government because the government prevents suicide as a handmaid. And this all ties to theme number 2, where controlling governments strip people of their basic freedoms. The characterization and allusions show how their most basic freedoms have been stripped, being treated with dignity, and their only way out of the oppressive society is gone. This can also be seen in North Korea in the article Human Rights Watch, where people are not allowed to voice their own opinions, a person's basic rights. So therefore, this human rights declaration is represented mostly through dialogue.
Our other sponsor for today is SpaghettiOs. I love SpaghettiOs. Your mom loves SpaghettiOs. Your dog loves SpaghettiOs. Even your neighbor across the street that you haven't talked to in 5 years because your mom fed their dog SpaghettiOs and the dog got sick all over your neighbor's new artificial plant, which caused all this neighborhood drama and a huge falling out between the two, loves SpaghettiOs. Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs. Anyways, back to the show.
May has done quite well for a presentation or her view of how dialogue is strong. I have to admit, she did make some good points. However, there seems to be some lacking within them. Point 3 of the theme theme of page 83, he tells us what we want him to believe. He's very convincing. He's very good with manipulation. However, the media is always trying to convince something is not. Our media is always convincing. I mean, most media try to stay in the middle point. However, there is always a side left or right. So it means not that surprising. There's also way to read tonight. Well, it could be seen that, she's just being suppressed. It's more way to be the gender than more than the media from my point of view. How the female gender is being suppressed in Gilby compared to this media in general. I also feel like that in the other example she's shown in page 54, how they feel lonely, they could die. How that it seems to be more, that is being an example from the media. I feel it's more of just showing how one side is being more dominated than the other, with them being forced to do things they do not like. Anyway, to be the strongest narration. As we all know, narration should be always part of a good story, or any story, in fact. I see it being used a lot within Gilread, with the first theme being shown is through in page 40, how talking about the names, how having a name can make them be risky as it being different or someone new. Compared to the past, Alfred and a couple other handmaids used to have names. However, before they have the names taken away and mean all similar compared to the last handmaids. Being new could get them attached to the world, and being new can get them targeted. That's why it's so dangerous. The second theme of being shown is within page 45 of she has to say more. Be seen to be feared of the government as following afterwards. Beforehand, I was talking about under the eye, of it being a saying, meaning that they're under the government and saying farewell. The fact that she's afraid to say something after that statement means that the government is controlling them, and they can't discuss their own beliefs. Another example could be seen within page 71, as they couldn't even talk without belief that the believers might report them. However, they did talk as they believed that the vials will protect them as long as they be quiet. Gives some visual imagery of them standing motionless while they try to be safe as possible without the government catching them, or so they believe. Lastly, there's some censorship within Gilead. Seen within a quote, how they show only victories, never defeats. Who wants bad news? Possibly he's an actor. This shows how they're messing with the media so they can manipulate people thinking that everything's fine within Gilead, so they don't leave or possibly do anything rash. Overall, if you've seen that narration, there's many reasonings how there be violations of human rights.
Thank you, Vincent, and I do agree with your point of narrative being significant to the story. However, I think that your argument is a bit underdeveloped. Your quote about Offglen's hesitation has a very limited connection to the narrator. You are also using a lot of reference to other lit terms or other lit devices such as visual imagery and characterization, which means that your argument of narrative wouldn't exist without these other crucial lit devices. For example, you indirectly characterize the handmaids as emotionless and the citizens as oppressed and foolish, which further shows how characterization underscores the lack of rights in Gilead. This goes to show that your argument of violating human rights being shown strongly through a narration would be very hypothetical without the use of the strongest lit device in this argument, characterization. Now, I know we could go on arguing for hours and hours, but I think it is time that we should wrap this up. Atwood clearly conveys the ideas of a loss of identity, censorship of the media, and a lack of freedom of expression and opinion in her book, The Handmaid's Tale, which tied closely to the Article 19 of the Handmaids of the Declaration of Human Rights. While all of our individual lit devices showed these themes very well in the book, I think that it is obvious that my lit device of characterization was the strongest when predicting the violation of human rights in society.
Thank you for tuning into today's show with Atwood's Rights Nights. We wish all of our listeners well, and we hope you learned something today. Also, remember to smile and to be nice to people, even your neighbors. Thank you.